Welcome to the Human Flourishing Project. I'm your host, Alex Epstein. You're probably surprised to be getting an episode 2 or 3 days after the last episode, given that we usually do this bi-weekly. But there was a time-sensitive opportunity that I wanted to take advantage of. And here it is. For those of you who've listened to the show for a while, you know that I've become very interested in the issue of nutrition. And in particular, there's this broader question that a lot of the podcast is based on, like how do we get real knowledge about issues that are crucial to human flourishing? And one of the archetypical issues that I've focused on is nutrition, because that's just such a crucial thing to quality of life and length of life, and because I myself uh, have a lot of uncertainty about it. And when I did 3 nutrition episodes, maybe about a year ago, and someone reached out to me. This is one of the really cool things about having this podcast, that sometimes really smart people reach out to me. And there was a guy named Ray Cronise, whom I had heard of vaguely. He's mentioned in Tim Ferriss's book, The 4 Hour Body. And he was also the person who helped the magician Penn Jillette lose 100 pounds. And it was, I believe, dominantly based on potatoes. We'll have to check that out, check that with Ray. But I mentioned on the show just some of my different struggles in figuring out what was true. And then I also mentioned that I had been experimenting with just eating potatoes for a significant amount of time, and that I wasn't 100% happy with it, but there were certain aspects of just eating potatoes that I really enjoyed. And I really felt like my energy levels were good. I felt really good a lot. And then subsequently, I've been eating a little bit more conventionally. I eat a lot with a meal delivery service called Thistle that's mostly plant based, but has a lot of meat. You can add meat to the entrees, which I usually do. And it's been going pretty well, but I've felt like there's got to be a better way. And when I talked to Ray, we probably talked 6 months ago or so, maybe 9 months ago. And what struck me about him was that, well, he had the conclusion of being advocating, what they'd call a whole food plant-based diet. So that in and of itself is not unusual. But what really struck me about him was that he seemed very aware of the need to have the right methodology, including to have the right standard of evaluation. And when we started talking, one thing he tried to make clear early on is that he's really focused on longevity and what he calls health span. So the ability to live and feel good for a long amount of time, including things like energy and all kinds of different abilities. And it struck me that, and he mentioned that he thinks some of the disagreement in nutrition has to do with the fact that other people are not optimizing for health span, and maybe they're optimizing for weight loss or for athletic performance. And it struck me that's a really good thing to optimize for. That's what I want to optimize for. And then the other aspect of optimizing for health span is that even though he's advocating plant based as his conclusion, he was very emphatic with me that this is in no way based on the value of unaltered nature or being natural or anything like that. And I hope he doesn't mind me repeating it, but I remember very strongly when I raised this possibility to him, he said, I would eat goat testicles if that were the best thing for health span. And I thought, this is, whether this guy is right or not, this is the right this is the right kind of standard to have. And I'm always very suspicious when somebody says, oh, well, I think you should only eat plant-based. And by the way, I think it's unethical for us to kill any animals ever. It's like people who say, oh, yeah, I'm against animal testing because I think that animals have rights, but don't worry, animal testing has never helped anyone at all and it could never be good. And like, that's obviously not true. It's obviously true that that your standard of evaluation is guiding the opposition to animal testing. And maybe you have a few instances where it's not actually good for human beings, but that's what's guiding you. And then you're using the alleged ineffectiveness of animal testing as a smokescreen. And I think that's what people often do with plant-based, where they clearly have an ideology that says, or a philosophy that says that we don't have a right to eat the animals, and then they convince themselves that is actually in our interest. So I was very intrigued. And just to end the intro, so I've been working on a book, and Ray was working on a book, which is coming out this week, which is part of the time sensitive element. And he sent me a copy. It's called The Healthspan Solution: How and What to Eat to Add Life to Your Years. And I started reading it, and I was really impressed by the methodology of the first several chapters of the book. It's mostly recipes, but there's a really interesting account of how he and his co-author think about nutrition, and it very much lives up to the pro-human and specifically health span focus of it. And it gives some really interesting research. So I thought what I'd do is I would bring Ray on the program, and I have two goals. One is I would like him to get across his overall methodology and conclusions. And then I would like to ask him what he would recommend to me as a sort of guinea pig. That's not quite the right way of putting it, because he's saying he has a lot of evidence, but I'm up for revising my eating, not because I'm in some desperate problem, but because I've had experiences that make me think there's a better way. And in particular, I'm intrigued by the prospect of eating less frequently, because I think that would help my energy levels. And then I eat about 4 times a day right now, and that's kind of annoying and sometimes leads to different kinds of energy drops and at least distractions that I don't like. So those are my two goals. And with that very long introduction, let me welcome Ray Cronise. Ray, welcome to the Human Flourishing Project.
Thank you for having me, Alex. I think in hearing your intro, there's 3 things that stick out to me that suggest you're probably going to succeed at this, and I'll tell you what they are. First, the first thing is talking about potatoes. So we can get into that separately, because I'm not the potato diet guy. But what I can say is the fact that you talked about potatoes instead of saying carbs means that you're actually trying to get a little closer to food. I think one of the problems we describe in the book, we describe elsewhere, is that macro confusion. Idea that while protein, carbs, and fat do describe, similar energetic biomolecules, they aren't isometabolic in terms of food. And what I mean by that is just because you're eating a protein or a carbohydrate or a fat doesn't mean that they're going to be metabolically similar. Eating apples and the equivalent calorie of apple juice is not metabolically similar. So to distill it down to that level is part of where I think a lot of this confusion is coming in. So in all of our conversations, our emails back and forth and such, you always are talking about whole food, and this is a really important thing. And that'll include plant and animal source food. We can talk about it, but when we start distilling it down, it's kind of like what we see in lots of other statistics where things start getting hidden. The second thing that I think is important is that human flourishing and in your individual flourishing is a priority in what you're trying to do. And why is that, I think, that indicative of success? Well, because it may be, and it's probably highly likely, that what we eat to flourish, to, say, spend the first 15 years reaching reproductive age, the next 15 to 20 years of reproductive prime, and then we'll tack on 15 years for raising your youngest offspring. Sometime around 45 or 50, evolution is done with us. And the kind of diet we might want to live that is maybe a trade-off from maybe not being as reproductively successful, and I don't mean not reproductive, I'm just saying being optimized for reproduction versus optimized for a long, healthy life. Those two things turn out to have some trade-off in the literature in organisms. Things that make organisms far more reproductive tend to make them live a shorter time, and vice versa. It's as if, Mother Nature is, to invoke the nature thing, Mother Nature is holding us around until reproductive will be better in favor of evolution. And the third thing is that you're not putting really any hardcore social or ideology like you described about me, but in doing so, you would be perfectly happy, whatever that diet is, if it can help you do more on what your book projects are and what your projects are with fossil fuels and your projects with communication and getting people to think things. So those 3 things are all elements to maybe lay a foundation for your audience that doesn't know me to see that, this is the way I feel when we're looking at food, and what we're recommending is how can we not just live longer, but live healthier. And that becomes, that gets distilled down in a lot of research over the last 80 years that really suggests that less is more. That is the way we have extended the life of other organisms, be it yeast or from yeast to primates, when we feed them paradoxically 30 or 40% less than they would eat in sort of when left to their own regard. And I'm talking about excessive diets of the West and all the crazy stuff that we do as humans. I'm talking about just organisms or just animals in a lab. When we restrict their diet by 30 to 40%, they often live 50% longer. Certainly on the longer lived organisms like primates, they live healthier. So this sort of flies in the face of the idea of a century or so of dietitian or dietetics and healthcare concept on getting enough food and having enough. And when food was economically scarce, that was the biggest problem. And I think, sort of to draw a parallel with your research on the fossil fuels, is that, cheap, affordable energy is something that people really need. And what we really now have is the other side of that, which was cheap, affordable food. And it's gotten so cheap and so affordable that we're chronically overnourished.
So let me ask about that, because you mentioned this less is more, and so this you answered some of what I was going to ask about this, but it seems like part of what you're doing is just looking at, because there's just so much alleged research on nutrition. In your book, you point out a couple of examples where just people are trying to do things about carb intake and fat intake that are just mixing together things by non-essentials, like just the apple and the apple juice, and just treating those both as carbs. How are you going to generalize if you're lumping those? I mean, this is what Ayn Rand would call an intellectual package deal, and that's all over the place in terms of that. But one thing you seem to be doing is just looking across the studies that have been done on humans, but then other organisms. And one question is, what makes you think that the organisms will have commonality? And I'm interested in what you have to say about that. But seems like you're looking and you're saying, okay, the maybe the one thing, or maybe there's two or three, but the one thing that's known is that when we restrict calories to a certain degree, at least obviously if you restricted them too much, then things would die. But if you restrict them to a certain degree across a wide number of organisms, or a wide range of organisms, this is almost always true. So is that correct? That it almost always increases longevity?
Yes, and another book that is a great book that just came out by one of my collaborators on some of the papers. Maybe you can post some of our actual peer review papers before the book, But David Sinclair is one of my collaborators at Harvard. He just came out with a book called Lifespan, and he discusses in his book, it's Lifespan, why we age and why we don't have to. But anyway, in Lifespan, he discusses the underpinnings, the genetic underpinnings. He's a geneticist at Harvard, and he suggests that, when we look at this really disparate group of organisms, from sort of a speciation perspective, we look at their genes. It turns out that these sirtuin genes, and there's 7 of these that have been identified, these sirtuin genes are seen throughout life. When we take a rodent, for example, one of the original experiments in longevity was some rodents in 1935. Clive McClave did these experiments where he reduced the calorie to these mice or these rats, and they actually lived longer, and documented. It's one of the first times when that was done. And at first it was thought of just as calorie. But what we're learning is actually it's more specific than calorie. When you restrict calorie, you restrict lots of other things. And we go into some of those details in the book. But for expediency here, this idea that when we do that with mice that have been now genetically altered 80 years later, so that they have those genes snipped out, they no longer live longer. Now the dietary restriction doesn't work. So we know that we've identified those, and we know that there is a number of other things. And the stuff that you were talking about with Tim Ferriss, which is mild cold stress. He did a chapter on that, my original weight loss, and actually that's how David and I met at TEDMed. Was this idea that, that there was more to the work I was doing on mild cold stress than just sort of a calorie deficit, which is where I started. And it turns out that at a cellular level, at the mitochondrial level, which is the power plants of each cell, it turns out that these survival programs are there. And that, even though when we look at all the different theories of aging that we've seen over the last, century, it turns out not to be just genetic mayhem, that everything's just being scrambled. It turns out that it's being modified, and it's more of akin to sort of a dirty desk. Each cell that has a nucleus in your body that has DNA or genetic material, your DNA is the genetic blueprint for tens of thousands of proteins, plural. And that could be insulin, or it could be keratin. I mean, there are a lot of different proteins. It's not a single stuff, just like plastic isn't a single substance. What plastic are we talking about? Lexan or polyethylene, So there's tons of different kinds of polymers. And the same thing goes for proteins. These are long polymer chains as well. And it turns out that they have a different composition of amino acids. There's a lot of different signaling goes on. But through a long, complex set of instructions, your body started as a single cell, and every cell in your body has the blueprint for every other cell in your body. But when you start unpacking the wrong part of that DNA, and this is an oversimplification, so if you're more advanced in science, don't take this as an exact discussion, but I think it's a good analogy. If you start unpacking all of these things, it's like, sort of having that messy desk. And now you're not working as effectively. And what these sirtuin genes seem to do is clean things up, seem to pack that genetic material back to where it goes. And we talk about this a little bit in the book. So getting back to this about how do we figure out, well, first, what you said, I mean, the idea that we can restrict certain things like certain amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein, with yeast, and they can live longer. We can do it with rats. They live longer. We can do it with worms. We can do it with fruit flies. And even in primate studies where we restricted, it's there. When we do human studies, Walter Longo's done a lot of those. And when we do those, even though humans live a lot longer, and of course we can't feed them in a controlled way their whole life, but we also see right there that they're getting the same biomarkers, things like TNF alpha, things like IGF-1. These are all these kinds of markers that we can use. And it turns out that it really seems that dietary restriction works. After the various wars, we've had situations in wars where people were restricted from food for 2 or 3 or 4 years while the war was going on, and we see longevity bumps in those populations later. Or we look at the diet of, like, if you know Dan Buettner's work with the blue zones, and look at some of the various cultures that eat in a certain way that just naturally restricts it. So that's the confidence that we have. I mean, it's an oversimplification of a lot of things, and even our book is a simplification or a distillation of this. But for everyone looking, in my case, I started out wanting to lose weight. I was basically on type 2 diabetic. I was having problems with glucose. And the surprising answer is my diabetes got worse when I lost my weight. And when I started trying to reverse this insulin resistance, having all of these issues, it completely went against everything I believed to be true, that eating more corn, more beans, more rice, more potatoes would make my glucose control better. I would have thought I want to eliminate those things and eat the stuff that I was eating, salmon and eggs and those kinds of things. That's the way I thought then. But my diabetes was getting worse, and then this changed it. And so back to bringing this full circle back to something that you've experienced, one of the great things about these foods, and we use a food triangle, which I may describe in a second, but we use a food triangle to describe food so that we talk about food and not protein, carbs, and fat, is that when you switched over, for example, to potatoes, yes, it simplified your life. And I've heard, lots of your shows that are dedicated to efficiency and using your time more effectively and getting your other ideas out and not wasting it on things that aren't as important. And so like me, and like a lot of people like us, Peter Diamandis, another mutual friend, Dan Sullivan or Joe Polish, all of these people that we know that a lot of times we would rather work and get things done than stop to have some decadent meal. That's not necessary. I'm not saying we never want to do it, but what you were able to do, I think, when you did the potato thing for a while, it wasn't the potatoes per se, but the fact that plant food just is naturally higher volume with less calorie. And so you were kind of doing a form of dietary restriction without even knowing it. And that's really the thesis of our book, is that when you're eating these plant source foods, one of the main benefits isn't the green smoothie and how much, plant matter can you swallow for vitamins and minerals, et cetera, but rather how can you actually eat a big volume of food and not get the excess nutrition.
So yeah, and yeah, I definitely recommend people getting the book because it goes into the food triangle. I think that probably the most relevant part for this audience is one interesting thing about the food triangle, and maybe I'll give you a minute to describe it, but then I have some other stuff, is just that it's interesting how what works really well with machine energy is problematic in human energy, because in machine energy, all things being equal, you want things as concentrated and refined as possible, because the hardest kind of power to produce is mobile power. And so the best thing for that is a highly concentrated, refined source of energy. But the machines can use an effectively unlimited amount of energy, and sort of the more concentrated, the better. Whereas we are running, if we consume too much energy, we're not making good use of it, and it's counterintuitive. So my understanding of the food triangle is, yeah, this is a part where you're consuming calories in a very non-dense form, where you tend to get filled up by them in terms of your body's lack of desire for consuming more, but you've actually consumed less of them, versus if you're eating fatty meat, or if you're drinking apple juice. Is that
Right,
the basic
right.
idea?
Yeah, and to take our fossil fuel analogy even further, let's just say your favorite, Alex Epstein's favorite thing in the world is to fuel his car. He's not driving a Tesla. He's driving one that takes fossil fuels. So we'll take that analogy further and say, I really love, there's nothing better than getting up in the morning and putting some fuel in my car. So you use gas up on the way to the office. You had a meeting, you go out and see if you could top it off a little bit. You know that you want to go out with your friends and get some gas in your car. So you say, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to let my car idle in the parking lot all morning so that the volume of the fuel will go down, because I want to top it off. Then you do that on the way home. You stop to get a quick, drink with the friends, and get a quick gas up before you go home and let it idle then. And then you say, if I would just wait and let my car idle all night long in the driveway, then in the morning, I'd have really a head start on this. And this is exactly how you eat. And you can ask yourself, what now? Let's play that forward on the lifetime of that car. Is the paint going to be bad? Probably not. Is the interior going to be messed up? Maybe not. It's been sitting there idling, but think about what's going to happen to the systems. To loosely use this analogy, what's going to happen to the fuel injectors? What's going to happen to the oil? What's going to happen to the rings and the pistons and all the internal parts? The fact is, you have been metabolically idling your car all day long and all night long. There is never a time when you don't do it. And so what ends up happening in that case is that it really serves as a perfect example of what we do with food, because what we can't store, our body has to metabolize. And so the other paper that we have, the oxidative priority, we won't go into details here, but just think of it this way. When we drink alcohol, this is the easiest way to get the concept. When we drink alcohol, you really don't turn it into fat. It doesn't turn into sugar. It doesn't turn into a protein. It doesn't turn into that. You end up metabolizing. So as that you start to drink after that last sip, your blood alcohol peaks about 2 to 4 hours afterwards or so, and then it comes down, and sometime around 4 to 6 hours after you've been drinking, your blood alcohol content's back to normal. Where did it go? Well, I'll tell you where it will go. You got sweaty, you got hot, you wanted to dance, you started getting talkative. Your body started having you do things that were expending energy, and your fat got suppressed. So now you're no longer metabolizing fat, which is why there's the appearance that alcohol makes you gain weight. It's just that you're not burning the fat as efficiently because your body's prioritizing the alcohol. It is an acute toxin, or it's a should you say it has a level of toxicity, not an acute toxin, level of toxicity, and your body needs to metabolize it and get it out of your system. Okay. So while it's doing all of that, it's not metabolizing other things. Well, each one of those macronutrients we talked about has a different priority, and we lay all that out in that paper. But the point I'm making here is you're either in the fed or the fast state, and the fed state lasts for 4 to 6 hours after your meal. Just because you stop swallowing doesn't mean you're still in that. People have gotten pasta sweats listening. People have gotten the meat sweats. If you go out and eat a ton of barbecue, you know what I'm talking about. And what happens is your body has to dispose of that which it can't store. And it's crazy to think that all the extra calories get stored as fat, because I gained 50 pounds over 20 years. And if you do the math back to the balance, that's only 168 extra calories a week. Nobody guesses their food intake for a week to that level. And this is why there's an issue with calories. It's not what some people say that, calories don't count. Calories count when you count all the calories, but it's very difficult to do if you're not measuring the waste heat, because just like that fossil fuel, most of the energy that you put in the tank leaves as heat, waste heat. And this is one of those things, if we say, for example, where does do you get better gas mileage in the city or on the highway? And everybody's going to quick know that you get better gas mileage on the highway. And the question is, where does the extra mileage go? And without, testing you on that or whatever, the answer is it makes your brake pads hot. That's where it goes. You turn it into energy, you turn it into heat. Every time you stop, you're turning that momentum, that energy into heat. And likewise, your body is doing the same thing. If you're swallowing just to meet social norms or habituated desires to eat where you are with all of these extra meals, where you're just eating because, you're essentially idling that car, that metabolic, engine 24/7. And I believe that has a big part to do.
Yeah,
Does that help wrap it up in a...
that's fascinating. I like that. I mean, it's because we're one of the criticisms of intermittent sources of energy, where you can't control it; it just is controlled by the weather. Is that so if you have solar and wind on a grid, but you need basically a constant level of electricity, then what happens is the controllable sources are always getting cycled up and down. And I always analogize it to stop and go traffic, and you have huge efficiency losses both in terms of fuel economy, but also just in terms of the equipment, because the equipment has to be started up and stopped instead of and it just has huge wear and tear consequences. So I like the analogy that you used as well. So let me
Well, I want to add
so I
one
think
more thing real quick
oh
on
yeah, go
that.
ahead.
And obviously that's true for electric cars too, because that's what they do. They dump batteries into brake heat. So that's true. And then the other thing that you said that's so important, I've heard you bring this up before when I was listening to you, and I've always wanted to be able to say it, so I can now, which is the problem when we look at this analogy because that obviously is a very loose analogy to help us frame how to think about it. It's not the detailed science, but why it's helpful is that when we look at replacing fossil fuels with some of these intermittent type energy sources, one thing we got to look at as a human is that, I've been up to 24 days with no food and I did just fine. In other words, we carry an enormous amount of fat supplies. The longest medically supervised water fast was 382 days. So,
Whoa.
okay, so once you start saying I'm skipping meals and then you compare that to 24 days without food, and by the way, all of my biomarkers got more healthy during that time. Yes, I lost, 25 pounds of body fat, but that's what it's there for. It is our fat. It is our energy storage organ. It is our fuel tank. But during the day, our body is constantly trying to actually dump the excess energy because we don't have anywhere to put it. And unfortunately, since we don't have backup battery banks and we don't have anywhere to bank it, our body just dumps it as waste heat.
Oh, that's
You
that's
see?
fascinating. So let me yeah, that's really helpful. So I think that this so far has given people just a flavor of how you think about this and and uh and how you approach it. And so what I want to jump into now for the last 10 minutes we have is my own very specific project. And I emailed you about this. And but my basic question is, okay, let's say January or even tomorrow, if I'm gonna start, I'm totally open to eating this way and certainly trying it out for a while and seeing how I feel. Because how I mean, if I felt like crap, but that would be incompatible with health span increase, obviously. I would like to be able to eat in a way where, I felt good. It at least had a chance of extending my health span, and where but part of feeling good is I'm a little worried, oh, am I going to feel hungry all the time? And then part of the question is, well, how much of the different foods in this book do I eat? So if you were to give me, so my desires, I want to err on the side of something that's too prescriptive, where you can just tell me, or I can have an assistant make me food and give you just tell me, okay, here's how you should get started for the next 2 months. And it doesn't have to be incredible tasting, but hopefully is a little less monotonous than only potatoes. Like what would you prescribe for me?
Yeah, so first of all, remember that we are creatures of habit. And, to an alcoholic, when you give up alcohol, you do feel bad for a while. So, this is true. If you think about it, headache, irritability, lack of focus, lethargy, none of those are hunger symptoms. That's the same thing that happens when you give up lots of habituated ingested substances. I'm not suggesting that it's at the same level of addiction or anything like that, or food's addicting. This isn't a sugar's addicting argument. This is just the idea that our body has a natural way to respond to these sudden changes. I mean, even to a person trying to stop biting their fingernails, some of those kinds of things could happen. So this is really about breaking these kinds of habits. So the point here is you probably will feel a little bit crappy when you're making a change. And this is the opposite of what happens when you're trying to be more feckin'. A lot of times when you're working out, yeah, you might be sore, but you actually feel on fire. You feel like ready to go. And that might be a false sense of security about what we're trying to do. So what I would suggest, number one thing is decrease meal frequency. The number one, if the number one thing a person could do out there listening is decrease meal frequency and stick with it long enough until you're not bothered by it. For most people, I think most people can skip breakfast. We were just always told not to. The small, frequent meals, 6 meals a day, boost your metabolism, which is just not correct. It's correct, but for the wrong reasons. So decreasing meal frequency is the number one thing. That gets you back time that you can use, and I know how you are with trying to optimize time and not wasting time. You could have some time that you could put back. It may be that for the first, certainly for the first 3 or 4 days, it will probably reach a crescendo of uncomfortable, but then you'll get beyond that. The next thing to do is to source more of your food from the right side of the food triangle. And very quickly at the top, at the apex, we have leafy greens, cruciferous vegetables, mushrooms, bulbs like onions and garlic, stems like asparagus, celery. These are high fiber plant foods that, have virtually no calories. To the left side of the food triangle, descending side, we have animal sourced foods, poultry, eggs, dairy, beef, seafood, all of those things. Down the right side of the food triangle, we have starchy vegetables, fruits, things that are plant-based, but they also have packaged with them some of the energy components to include fats that are in nuts, seeds, avocado, coconut. Now, nowhere on that food triangle is any kind of oil or any kind of refined sugar or any kind of refined flour. We're not talking about those food adulterants. We're not talking about salt. These are all things that do make food taste good, but they're off the food triangle. So what I would have you do is eat less frequently, eat more from the right side of the food triangle, which means you'll probably actually have to eat meals that are a little bit larger volume than you're used to. So that's kind of a good side. If you love to eat and you can, and for the most part, meat is a delivery system for sauce. And so can vegetables can be, if you take the same amount of time. If you've only had vegetables smothered in butter and salt, I can understand why you don't like them. But, like our sriracha stuffed mushrooms in this book, if I gave them to anybody, as long as they didn't have a nut allergy, they would love them and they would just eat them as they are. And you could eat the whole tray and it wouldn't be too much. So what you're going to find, there's no nutritional information on any recipe. I don't know if you noticed that. There's no
Yeah,
calorie
I did
count.
notice that.
There's no
Yeah, I
calorie
don't know.
count.
That's kind of, I don't know what to do with that.
I
Because
know.
I'm wondering, well, how much should I eat? And if
And
I don't eat enough, am I going to be, am I going to just be starving all day?
And that's exactly the question you need to be asking, which is, why does a number help you get there? It's not helped you to this point. It really hasn't. We only count calories really when we're trying to justify eating more. If you think about it, I mean, for millions of years, we got by without calories and nobody had a problem with it, right? You ate until you're full and you stopped, or you ate until your food ran out, right? So, or you managed your food because you only had so much that you had to divide. But the idea that somehow you're going to play nutritional macronutrient magic and get your food right and manage your life by swallowing is a little bit of hubris, for me. So what I'm saying is eat less often, and for some people, they want to eat early in the morning. I'm not really even at this point even saying what time of day to eat. There are obviously optimal things, but to me, that's like organic and GMO and all this other crap. Extra details that we don't need to worry about right now. And then the last element of that is going to be, so eat less frequently, eat mostly from the right side of the food triangle, all for a while if you want to, just like you did there. And then finally is develop the kinds of foods so that you have this new appreciation until the new diet is equally convenient, familiar, and enjoyable to the old one. You don't have a choice. One or more of those will dominate your plate. So part of this, which is exactly what you have taught all of us in your, the flourishing, in the Human Flourishing Project, about developing good habits, it takes a while to do that. So you're going to have to pick a period and say, no matter what, I don't care if it's somebody's birthday. I don't care if I get out, it's an important book business meeting. I'm going to stick to what I'm doing right here and not have a social interruption of food. I mean, look, we're right in the middle of a social food celebration that started, you could go all the way back to, Memorial Day, but let's just say for Halloween. And we go from Halloween to Thanksgiving, and Thanksgiving to Hanukkah to Christmas and to New Year's Eve. And then we're going to skip a little bit, and then we're going to go to, what's the next one? Then we're going to go to Valentine's Day. Then we're going to drink green beer because we got to do that in March, right? That's going to give way to all the candy and eggs and chocolate bunnies in April. And then in May, it's, oh, wow, the summer's starting. Let's have our Labor Day, or is it Labor Day? Yeah. Then it's going to be, the summer and vacation. We got to eat when we're on vacation. Our trip is just one series of meals with a little fun in between. Where are we going to breakfast? Where are we going to have lunch? Where are we going to have dinner? Are we going to go out and get ice cream tonight or not? And then it's going to be 4th of July. And then the whole freaking thing starts over again. We are a society of one meal that takes breaks to sleep and work. So it should not come as a surprise to you who has mastered changing habitual things in your life that it's going to take some work, because everyone's doing this on autopilot. Everyone is. Not just some of us. We all are. And it's not a knowledge game. It's a complex series of urges and biological imperatives, because we evolved in a world of scarcity. We don't have coping mechanisms, or we likely don't have coping mechanisms for excess, because in what environment could we have had deficient calories and sufficient nutrition? Not in any time in the past. And that's what your average diet is. Let's cut down just the calories, but let's keep having full nutrition. Well, what's to say that when your body has restricted nutrition for a limited period of time, it doesn't kick in coping mechanism so you don't get a headache, so that you don't have a lack of energy, so that it relies on this backup fuel, right? So the three things are: eat less frequently, pick those times, eat from the right side of the food triangle, and then finally develop some recipes that are sufficient, 5 to 7 of them that you can rotate. And I know this is your personality from our conversations before. Soups are amazing. The first chapter of our recipes are soups. Anybody can cook soups. You throw a bunch of stuff in a pot. There's a couple of them that are more complex than that, but really, You throw a bunch of soups. Get your soups. Now you can freeze them. Now you can grab and not have to worry about what you're doing because you really don't want to stop what you're doing. You just sort of need to or think you should. Salads. Salads are a little bit more difficult. They take a little bit more finesse just because you're dealing with things that can go bad in the refrigerator. But once you learn, and once you learn to make amazing dresses and sauces for them and not just eat leafy greens, but we have bean salads and all kinds of other type, that becomes there. Side dishes. Really what eating on the right side of the food triangle is eating side dishes, right? You're just leaving out the middle meat, you're just simply, you eat the plant or eat the animal that ate the plant, but the nutrition actually came from the plant. That's just the way it is. Animals concentrate nutrition, they don't necessarily create it. And so then the final thing are sweets. Now, sweets aren't dessert. Sweets are tons of fruits, and there are amazing kinds of fruits, and there's really very little studies. Everybody who's so afraid of sugar and say, oh my gosh, this banana, it's got sugar, it's got sugar, it's sugar. This is, again, nutritionism. This is, going down to individual things and sort of them missing the forest for the trees, where eating huge amounts of fruit, and you have to eat a lot of it. I mean, I've got a really good friend of mine who eats exclusively fruit. And when I look at, what a grocery list, when he gives me a grocery list of what, what to get for an average week, it's an enormous amount of food. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, he would tell me to get around 40 bananas, 20 mangoes, 25 apples, and 6 papayas just to start. So if you try to do an all fruit diet, I'm not recommending that people do that, but I'm saying if you wanted to do it, you have to eat an enormous amount of food, which you talked about earlier. Maybe some of those issues have been not eating enough. But so the point is, go through that. You would go through and find some very simple meals using vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, mushrooms, nuts, seeds, herbs, and spices. Go through there and find 5 or 6 recipes that you know how to shop for, your assistant knows how to shop for, 5 or 6 recipes that you can rotate. I mean, it seems complicated, but so would, going to Subway. If you think about going to Subway, if you actually had to set up the Subway line, all that stuff that they have cut up, that they stuff magically on that huge, roll, it would take a long time to chop and put all that stuff out, right? But if you're prepared, your sub gets made really quickly. And that's called mise en place in cooking. So I went back to culinary school to try to translate these things. So those are the 3 things I'd recommend you do. Eat less frequently, eat more plant foods, all plant foods if you will, and pick 5 to 7 recipes and just focus on those. And work on getting those systems in place, just like you do with your dog on the beach, just like you do with how you systematize and you're writing the second edition of your book, just like you've done with these things of reclaiming your time. I can't remember right now that one thing that you say that was really good, but what is the one subject you talk about with this, about time wasters? Reverse.
Oh, I'm not sure which one you're referring to.
It's like reverse something, but I can't remember it.
Reverse procrastination?
That's it.
Okay.
So you can plan in this idea that, okay, it's probably going to be a little boring for a while. It's probably going to be a little uncomfortable for a while. But what's going to happen if you do this for 6 weeks? It's going to become your new normal, because humans have tons. I go all over. I'm about to go to Thailand to teach cooking in Thailand. Totally different palate. Amazing food, by the way. And it's just, if you go from culture to culture to culture, the one thing you know is that we find decadence in all kinds of crazy things that we call food. It's not one thing.
Yeah, I like that. All right, I gotta wrap up. Speaking of my dog, I owe him some time right now because
Great.
I'm taking this off on a Saturday. But I hope we get to do another podcast at some point. I think this was a great introduction. Let me just answer this in 15 seconds. If I had to pick 2 times of day to eat, and you would prescribe them, what would you choose?
The 2 times where you're most comfortable. For me, I tend to get hungry later in the evening. So if I eat, all the hours I get behind me are hours I won't overeat. But if I eat first thing in the morning, I might slip up later. So I like to eat later, but not necessarily right before bed. So I would say anytime up to, say, 4 to 6 hours before bed would be fine, and, afternoon. But just, each day you're going to get better and better. So go as long as you can, if that's the kind of thing. There are some people that with our clients that we have, there's some that just love to eat first thing in the morning. Then they have their midday meal and they're done. That's it. They're done for the day. They're okay. That's not me. So I think that part is highly individualistic without trying to optimize it.
Got it. Okay, now, so tell the audience what they can do to get the book or to get any other information you think they should have.
Yeah, so our website is healthspansolution.com. You can sign up there. We're not spammers. We don't spam people with that, but it'll help us keep in touch with you. We're on Amazon, Healthspan Solution. You can get the book there. Juliana Hever is the plant-based dietitian, and she's my partner in everything, really. And we put this together, and she's a registered dietitian and comes at this from 15 years of that experience. So I just think if you'll take a look at our book, I think everybody's going to be surprised, because we took the traditional cookbook, and instead of putting pantry tips and how to water saute, we put 4 chapters of pretty dense science. Did you feel that it was more than you expected from a cookbook?
Well, I mean, it wasn't more than I expected from you,
Right.
so I wasn't at all surprised. But yeah, if I had just picked it up as a cookbook, I would have.
Yeah, you wouldn't
I
have known.
would have been. But I mean, I think it's. Yeah, I definitely recommend. I mean, those are the parts, and I haven't even read them in detail yet. I read certain parts in detail, but I'd really recommend people read it, and I think they'll notice certain kinds of methodology things that you don't usually see, and certainly it comes across as genuinely interested in health span as the goal versus that being window dressing for
Yeah.
some
And two-thirds
agenda.
of your plate ought to be fruits and vegetables, anything. So even if you don't want to go all the way plant-based, you're just plant curious, or you just want to have better side dishes or things that you can eat with how you're doing, this would be something that you can find those kinds of recipes as well.
Got it. All right. Got to run, Ray, but we will put this out, and I think the book comes out this week. So
Yeah.
I hope that people check it out, and I appreciate your work, and I appreciate your help with me.
Thanks a lot, Alex.
All right. Have a great day.
Okay.
Thanks again to Ray Cronise for coming on this impromptu episode of the Human Flourishing Project. Again, his book is The Healthspan Solution. Definitely interested in what listeners of this show think, particularly of the first 6 chapters, and in particular, if you have any objection to something he said or something he wrote, I think that would be really interesting, and particularly if any of you have any kind of have done any kind of in-depth study of nutrition, because as I've mentioned before, I would love to get more debate among intelligent people about nutrition. So if anything he said or wrote throws up red flags, or you think he's taking something out of context or misrepresenting something, that would be really, really interesting. And for the time being, I'm going to try to experiment with what he's recommending. And so I will periodically report on how it's going, or if I abandon it, I will talk about that as well. Okay, thank you for listening this week. That is our show. As usual, if you have any questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail, you can email me at alex@alexepstein.com. No responses promised, but I love to read your emails. Also, to join a discussion, you can go to facebook.com/Human Flourishing Project. And to get the updates whenever there is a new show, including a special impromptu show like this one, go to humanflourishingproject.com. Okay, I expect to be back in about 2 weeks. Until then, I'm Alex Epstein. This has been the Human Flourishing Project.